Hey there, this is Derek Murphy from creativity.com. Today I wanted to kind of walk you through the process of choosing the right cover and title and subtitle tagline for your genre, for your book publishing experiment, and the reason it's so important to get right. So none of this is finished. I'm going to kind of show you the behind the scenes, the back and forth between me and one author in particular who's given me permission to share some of this stuff. And it's really important because although I talk a lot about, how to design a book cover, the truth is most cover designers, even if they're very good cover designers, they're not going to help you to figure out the genre. The genre is super important. The mood or the colors convey a certain thing. Usually there's one particular character and one particular background that communicates the genre, the story, what it's actually about, and then the fonts dictate the genre as well. You need your cover to be as clear as possible and hit as many boxes as possible without becoming overwhelming. You also don't necessarily need to repeat elements. For example, if it's a vampire cover, if you have vampire in the title, maybe you don't need to show a vampire bloody fangs also, because you're sort of losing real estate space when you duplicate elements. And this is, you want to hit the genre as hard as possible. You don't want to hit the story or the characters or a particular scene from the book. That's what most authors do. And the reason you don't want to do any of that stuff is that's not the cover's job. The cover's job is to get the click, and that's all. The cover, as a thumbnail, needs to be just attractive and clear enough about the genre so that it looks professional and that they know that this kind of looks like the kind of book that they're already looking for. It gives them enough of an indication that this looks professional and is what they want. And then, maybe in the description is where you will hit the details. So after they click the cover, they go to the description. The description has genre keywords plus same different. Basically, you don't want a book that's 100% unique and unlike anything that's ever come before, because they won't know how to place it. They're not looking for that. They're looking for something that they recognize, all the things that they want and like from that genre, the reason that they read that genre. That's what they want, and you need to communicate that your book is that, but different and new and interesting with specific twists. So you want to hit all the keywords they're looking for, but give them juicy hooks that are enticing because they're unique, to show, why this book fits in the genre, but is also unique enough to stand out. So generally, you want to overconform as much as possible. Overconform to genre expectations, because it's better to overconform and get the click than to not conform. So a lot of people will try to do details in their book cover to show why this story is unique or different, but that's not the right place because readers aren't sold yet. They're not going to be looking at your book cover for details about the story. That's what the blurb is for. The cover is just to get them to click. And so you can often just buy a pre-made cover, even if it doesn't 100% fit your particular story, and it will vastly outperform a more expensive custom cover that you told the designer exactly what to do. But sometimes, and this is a case that I'm going to go into, sometimes you have something that's very mixed genre, that's very difficult to define, that maybe you wrote the book and you didn't really think about the audience or the genre, and it doesn't fit into the neat genre classification. So then what do you do with the cover? What decisions do you make? That's what I'm going to talk about in this video, and it's super important. So I hope that you pay attention and that it's useful, and then you go watch all my other videos on cover design, because the cover design stuff, you can make a professional looking cover if you understand some basic rules about cover design, but it won't matter if you don't first figure out your genre and your audience. So for this particular project, the author supplied me with a potential title and some keywords and a short blurb and a few pages of the first part, but we had to kind of figure out what this actually is. So he had to sort of explain the different elements of the story, and then I have to use my decades of expertise to try to figure out, how to describe it quickly and accurately in a way that's attractive using the right keywords. And so this is, to generalize really quickly, basically a sci-fi time travel where it's sort of a young adult protagonist, but she grows older, so she actually has like a whole life. And from my understanding, it starts on the moon, and then she sort of time travels back to 1960s Canada, I think, Vancouver, and she joins some kind of rebel environmental eco warriors to assassinate people and save the world, something like that. So what I kind of came up with is an alternate history sci-fi with time travel and fantasy elements, which is sort of true, although I might actually cut out the fantasy. And I'll talk, this was only like my first stab at it. We went a little bit deeper. This was just so that I could figure out, what's the basic cover gonna look like. And he also sent me a picture to use. So I'm just using the model that he gave me without choosing, I kind of made some other recommendations, but basically I just had to use a background. So this was what I kind of started playing around with. But I said it sounds a little bit geeky. It's sort of the right audience. The problem is alternate history, that's one thing. Sci-fi is a different thing. Time travel is a totally different thing. It's not great, like even if you hit all the keywords, it's not great if you say a whole bunch of different things, because then you're not appealing to four different audiences. You're excluding four different audiences because those audiences are not, they don't mix. People don't say, oh, I like one of these four things, so I'm going to pick it up. If they don't like three of those things, they're going to put it down. So you want to be careful about, you want to hit keywords, but you don't want to just randomly name all the different genres. Originally, we thought it might sort of be urban fantasy because the picture he sent me is a girl with a leather jacket that's typical for urban fantasy. And if I put it in a modern urban setting like 1969, where the bulk of the story takes place, like there's a choice. Do I put it at the beginning on the moon, or do I put it in 1969 where most of the story actually happens? So after digging in a little bit deeper, I found out actually there's some humor in the book. So it's almost like a comedy or a space opera, but a space opera tends to be warships in space. And if this is also the problem with time travel, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but I have some time travel novels. I don't think time travel is a genre. I don't think there are time travel readers who read any kind of time travel. I think time travel is a writing device or element within any particular genre. It's not a universal audience that will just follow any time travel novel. They will read urban fantasy with time travel elements or sci-fi with time travel elements, but those are not, those are sort of mutually exclusive genres. You can't assume readers will go on board with your mixed genre mashup if it doesn't deliver on the main elements of the core genre that they thought that it was. Very few readers are looking for a unique, surprising reading experience that doesn't conform to the basics, the universal basics of good storytelling, which is another thing I have a ton of videos about, so I hope you check those out as well. There's also, I think, a really strong theme of conservation novel or activist, because I think, she's going back in time to save the world and kill these people to save Earth, basically. I don't know how much of this particular book has a lot of, eco philosophy in it. Some of them do. There is such a thing as like an ecological novel. It's not really a very popular novel. There are books that are important because they have an ecological bent, but the story always comes before any kind of ideology. So, maybe you can sneak in a little bit of ideology if you have a really soft touch with it, but generally, books that have really weak stories but are heavy on philosophy or ecology or save the planet or whatever, they're not usually very strong books. The story always needs to matter the most, and the story is driven by conflict and story architecture, and plotting, I think, because I'm a big plotter. But anyway, these are other elements that are important to think about, but we have to decide is like, these are like, are they the real thing, or do they have a false promise? Will they bring in the right audience who will also be happy with it? There's probably going to be a balance between the the people who like the thing that you've made, even if it's a very, very small audience, and the larger audience who might buy it because they think it's probably what they want to read. And then, even if they're not completely on board, hopefully you can suck them in with the writing and keep their attention enough to get them into the story. But that's not a given. If your cover didn't communicate the right things, and they bought the book on accident and it's not what they thought they were getting, you're going to get a lot of negative reviews. So there's some danger to overselling, by shooting for a larger genre, but there's also a danger to shooting for a tiny genre and then not selling any books. All right, so let's jump into Photoshop. These are just very, very quick mock-ups that I made in Photoshop. I haven't bought these images yet. I did ask for a high resolution copy of this model that came from the author, and to make sure that he has all the right permissions. You have to be very careful. These have watermarks on them because I haven't purchased them yet. I'll usually do mock-ups like this, and then once I, play around with the background and get the background that we agree on, I'll go back and buy all the pictures and redo it all, and make it all a lot better. The design on this is not great. The balance is not great, but it's not terrible either. It sort of works. And so this was the discussion. This was one of the other ones that I made. This is more of a young adult sci-fi, maybe sci-fi time travel. And this is, it could work. I think the colors are kind of nice. And I could do a lot of things with the colors, but I think basically as a layout, this was one idea. I don't love the font either, but there's generally sci-fi fonts. I think the problem with this one is it's it's sort of fine, but it's not really hitting any genre hard enough. And that's why I threw Time Travel Assassin on here. It's just a really quick little thing. But we're going to come back to that because the problem with naming your character, and the Chronicles is not a great keyword because it really just means the story of, and then this is a character that they don't know. So this whole title doesn't really communicate any value, any meaning. It's not great. So we're thinking about other ones, and Time Travel Assassin is sort of on the nose, but in general, this is all a little bit vague. Like this would sort of work, but it's you can't really afford to have a mediocre cover. Although most authors have terrible covers, so you really can't afford to have a terrible cover. Most authors, they either do it themselves, which is fine if you take the time to learn what you're doing, or they hire a designer who, even if they pay them a lot of money, maybe they're not really good book cover designers, and maybe they do exactly what the author wants, but it's a terrible idea and it's not right for that book or that genre. And so you can get a really clean, a good looking, well-designed cover that's pretty, and it just doesn't work because it's not communicating enough crucial information. It just kind of, it fades out. It's not shocking or eye-catching or whatever enough. There's so much competition out there. And all of my covers, I feel like my covers are fine. They're good enough for now, but eventually when I'm making more money, that's definitely something I will keep investing in. Whenever I see a new pre-made cover that I think is amazing, I might throw it on one of my series and see if it will perform better than what I've got, because the cover is going to make a huge difference in your conversion, in your sales, and everything. So it's really people ask me all the time for book marketing advice, or how do I sell, or how do I promote. Almost always, number one, the cover that they have is it needs to be redone. They're not going to get any traction with the cover that they have, even if they spent money on it, which is too bad. But that's why I put all this stuff out on YouTube, is so that people who want to learn can figure it out, and they will have a massive advantage promoting their books because it does really matter. Anyway, so I was kind of saying like this one is fine, but it's not specific enough. It looks a little too somber, especially with her face. It looks a little too dramatic. This would be fine for like a time travel thriller, like a political thriller or assassination, whatever. However, this particular sci-fi, I think, because like I mentioned, it has a humorous aspect. I think it's a little bit more like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's sort of a dark tongue-in-cheek humor. So the interesting thing that I just found out, which I don't think I've ever mentioned before, is you can really communicate comedy with color. So like basically this is the original version, just mocking it up, which is fine, but with your cover design, you really want to beef up the colors and everything. I do have a tool that is on DIYbookcovers.com that I'm getting rebuilt because Flash stopped updating, so I have to redesign it from scratch. And eventually I'll have, a free online cover designer tool where you can do stuff like this if you don't have Photoshop. But for now, basically, I'm just playing with color washes. You could also just do it with the saturation or the hue. If I go to, most online photo design tools will have something like, let's see, hold on. So I go over here to image, I go to image adjustments, brightness, contrast, or hue and saturation. And then I could change any of the hues, although I'm just going to go back to this one layer because it's easier. So if I go to image adjustments, hue and saturation, this is to change the whole image. I could change any of the colors. So like if this was really like a space opera, purple green would work really well if there was a lot more like aliens, outer space stuff. But just like a really dramatic, really warm tones, more contrast, more saturation, the more color it has, the more comedy, or the more lighthearted, the more fun that it seems. I think that probably generally holds true. I don't think anyone else has ever made a similar claim, so that's what I'm saying, and I think I'm sticking with it. Because otherwise, even just like this, it's fine. But like, yeah, this looks fine. It looks like lifelike, but with the extra color, it just makes it look a little more fun and silly. The other kind of interesting thing with fonts, this font works really well for a generic, interesting sci-fi. The younger the audience, the bigger the design. So for a middle grade or like a young adult novel, you can have more crazy fonts, more fun colors and stuff like that. The more serious adult, the smaller, simpler the fonts, and the more subdued the colors. But all in all, like this basically sort of works for the project that I talked about because it's so difficult to get right. All right, so once we had like a sort of basic mock-up that could become the cover, once I play around with the spacing and the fonts and everything, we have to really nail down the title and the subtitle, which is a whole can of worms because it's really difficult to get this right. So the cover really matters, the design really matters, but the word choice for your project, all of the words you choose, are also really, really important in terms of visibility and discoverability. And they're difficult to get right without professional help. So I'm going to walk you through this conversation so that I can give you some of the same tips and pieces of advice that I'm helping this particular author with, in the hopes that if you don't have someone like this to work with you, you can figure some of this out yourself. So we were still playing around with some stuff, and I wrote Time Travel Assassin because it's a little edgier and a little broader than Time Travel Activist. So even though Activist is a little more specific for this particular type of book, Assassin is probably a better keyword because it will attract a larger audience. But I thought maybe something long like the time traveling earth saving adventures of Zarpagi, which could be a whole title. And for young adult books, sometimes you can get away with a really long title like that. However, those longer titles, they're often for like literary young adult, contemporary young adult, and then they have usually a handwritten font, something like this. So if I was writing, a typical contemporary young adult, with a long title like this could almost work if I played around more with the spacing. But I ultimately don't think that's the right choice for this project. So the way to add the humor is I thought the sometimes humorous earth-saving adventures of time travel activist Zaripagi. That's not a bad subtitle. With fiction, you don't really have subtitles. You sort of have taglines, but there's different people call them different things. Basically, the subtext that goes underneath the title. This is a pretty good one that hits a lot of keywords and is very specific and intriguing. But if we did it this way, we would need an actual title because I basically pulled all the words, so we don't have a title anymore and we have to rethink it. The author got back with a whole bunch of other suggestions, and of those suggestions, the closest one was The Adventures or the Revenge of a Teleporting Teenager and Occasional Assassin, which I don't love because it's a little bit wordy. I'm not sure. I think, teleporting might sound a little more edgy than time traveling. I think time traveling, it's hit or miss. It might attract to some people, or some people may not find it very interesting. Portals or portal fantasy is pretty hot. It's a thing. It's a genre. So you would have to do the research to figure out, between time travel and portal fantasy, which of those gets the most searches, but also which of those audiences is actually going to like this particular book, or which ones will feel cheated if this isn't really a time travel or a portal fantasy. So you want to be careful about, if you do overconform with the genre, you want to make sure you're delivering on that promise. So the other big challenge is that this particular title, to me, sounds like a middle grade book or a young adult book. And I think in this book, the protagonist starts off as a teenager, but through the story, it kind of goes through her living a full life into middle age. And at that point, it's not going to appeal to a young adult audience. It's very difficult to tell a sprawling story that goes across many decades because there's not a lot of urgency. And, that, of course, there are famous books that do that, but most successful books take place within a couple of years, or maybe there's like an epilogue or a prequel that's a decade before or after, but the majority of the book is generally in a small defined history of events where all of the events are critical dominoes leading to the final payout, which is the critical, massive psychological pressure that forces the protagonist to change and become the hero that's capable of dealing with the imminent threat. That's sort of what you need. If you don't have that, if you didn't write that kind of book, that's fine. Of course, I'm not talking about every book, but books that sell in commercial genres generally have a lot of things in common. And one of those is really tight pacing, where there's not a lot of time where the characters are not pressured to take action. The protagonist should always be anxious about taking the next step, or distracted by something else equally important, so that things are always moving pretty quickly. If you try to stretch it out over several decades, it's just more difficult to keep their attention, because if there was any threat, either they dealt with it and then they have a new threat later on, or it wasn't really a big threat after all. So what you really have is like a whole bunch of little episodes with little threats, but none of those little threats or episodes really impact the protagonist's character and decision in the final conclusion epic battle scene, in a really satisfying way. It doesn't have to play out like that, of course, but it's really satisfying when it does, and that's a lot easier with a shorter timeline. Anyway, sorry for rambling, but my point is that although, of course, there's a big audience for this type of book, I don't think it's a young adult or children's book, because those specifically definitely have to really hook attention and keep the ball rolling with a lot of action, adventure, or suspense and intrigue. Both of those are fine. Like, action, adventure are things happening, external threats. Suspense and intrigue are internal worries or fears because of unnamed or unknown mysteries in the world that the protagonist has not figured out. Ideally, you'll have both of those, but it really depends on the type of genre. And, if you have more of like a character-driven or a story-driven, sweeping, multi-decade story, there's an audience for it, but they're probably maybe deeper, more refined, more thoughtful readers. You can't get lazy about hooking their attention, unless you completely enamor them with the quality of the writing. But even so, few readers read books for the quality of the writing. Readers read books because they expect the payout to be satisfying. They expect the resolution to be worth all of that time they put in. All of those different, storylines will have a really satisfying emotional payout. Ideally, if it doesn't, if all the threads don't come together in a satisfying way at the end, they're going to wonder why all of those little episodes are worth it. It's really just a bundle of short stories. Anyway, I mentioned earlier that Chronicles is fine, but it's really just like saying the story, so it's not really adding anything. He also had one suggestion that was, like the name period and then assassin period, activist period, time traveler period, or something like that. Just those three keywords. I don't think those are as good, because it needs to be pretty obvious at a glance to the genre audience. This last line is kind of important, so I'll try to explain it. It needs more processing, and readers won't think or speculate. So you can't just give readers clues. You have to, you can't leave them to figure it out. Like, you can't plant details or seeds or like symbols that they're not going to understand until they read the book, because they're not going to read the book. 99% of the people who see your cover aren't going to read the book unless they already want to read that genre and they want to read, your book because it fits into what they want to read. That's the only reason people should be reading your book. Confused readers won't buy, which means, if your cover is like, that looks interesting, they're not going to wonder what it's about enough to click on it. They've got to already see that it's urban fantasy or epic fantasy, at least like the major big ones. You want to get as close to possible as your target audience, because if it doesn't pretty much look like it was designed to fit in neatly with the category that they enjoy, they're not going to buy it. And when they click on it, if you get people to click on it, the description is where you want to be very, very clear. So any of this material that we don't use, we're going to use in the blurb, because if we can get their attention with the cover, close enough, we want to, in the blurb, of course, we want to focus on the story. You want to focus on the hook. That's kind of what I'm saying here. It needs to be obvious at a glance. than the finer details in the hook or the subtitle or the tagline. So like there's a balance in the blurb with the hook and the story without it becoming a summary of the plot, because that's not what you want to do. You just want to summarize, what this is, who it's for, what are the what's the hook, which is basically like the biggest conflict and the biggest resistance point. So, what does your protagonist have to get through to survive? What's at stake for her and what's at stake for everybody else? And then how is this protagonist personally, like how is the goal resisting her efforts? It can't just be something she can or can't do. It has to be something with internal intrigue and conflict. Like she has to, she's betrayed by her lover or whatever. Like there has to be, the other thing, I'm going way off on tangents here, which I tend to do, but the other thing with blurbs that's really tricky, it can't just be external conflict that doesn't have any internal conflict. You need internal conflict. Internal conflict comes from character conflict. So you need multiple characters. You need enemies, but you also need allies or friends. It's okay if you don't have a love interest. You can have really strong siblings or, allies or whatever that don't have any romance. That's fine. But you need a lot of character conflict between characters who care about each other, who are willing to risk things for each other, because otherwise there's just no, it doesn't matter if they don't have a, like, it's not enough that they will die. They have to risk having their heart broken as well. They have to have an emotional risk and a physical risk. And as far as possible, you want to communicate some of that with the blurb by mentioning some of the interesting characters or some of the interesting intrigue or conflict between, even if you just throw out, the protagonist and then the guy who wants to kill her and her missing father who's still alive, and then the mysterious bad guy or whatever, and then a happy robot dog. Just throw in a few interesting, intriguing elements that paint a little picture of, like if you were looking at the Wizard of Oz poster, basically the poster of 4 very interesting characters in a very interesting landscape, that's what you would want to do in the blurb. However, that's not what you would want to do on the cover, because it would be way too detailed, and you don't have to mention all of the sub characters, especially all of the very specific sub characters in your story. Just for fun, I pulled up this cover I made a while ago for one of my projects. Someday I'll have time to write it. And this was an example of a multi-character cover. I think you can get away with 3 main characters. I don't think you always should. In this particular case, it kind of works pretty well. I like it a lot. But in most cases, like even in Harry Potter, there's basically 3 main characters, and you can pull off a 3-character novel. But even in the Harry Potter covers, almost all editions of the Harry Potter covers feature one central character, which is Harry Potter. It's the Harry Potter series, even though the other side characters, really carry all of the story. It's a 1-character thing. It's easier to pull off a 1-character cover. The other thing is, matching specific details, trying to get a very specific 3 different models. Designers have to pull from stock photography that we can use legally to create art like this, and we have to find something that exists, or we have to buy a 3D render that exists and swap the face or the head. The more you're trying to match specific details, the more of a pain in the ass it's going to be, and it's not really going to matter, because you've got a picture of what the character looks like in your head for sure, but it's not really going to matter to the readers, and it can be distracting. It's difficult to pull off. If you do really need a multiple character cover like this, it's probably going to include custom illustration. And there's a huge range. Custom illustration is when they're basically, free drawing with a pen. But generally, what tends to happen is they mock something up in Photoshop and then they trace around it with a Wacom tablet, and they add a lot of like a heavy illustrated highlights and lighting and hair and stuff that you see on a lot of fantasy and urban fantasy stuff. That's kind of a combination between Photoshop and illustration. This is something a lot of cover designers can do well, but we all have our strengths and weaknesses. I'm a lot better in Photoshop. I'm not great with a Wacom tablet and actually like drawing on the art because I still use my mouse. So my point is, like these can totally work with a really skilled, really quality designer, but it's probably going to be expensive and it might not actually be as strong or as powerful as if you had just put one main character. So that's basically all I've got for this particular video. Like I said, this is something I do with the people who join my guerrilla publishing course, where I can kind of walk them through setting this stuff up, because there are a lot of difficult decisions to be made. But this is also stuff that you can learn on your own, and just, you do the research and you think a lot about it and you make some decisions. Cover design is the hardest thing to get right, because if you're not a cover designer, even your best intentions, there's a separation between what you think you want and what actually is going to work to sell the book. And there's a separation between, quality professional looking cover design and what you are capable of doing with the tools that you have access to or that you're familiar with. So I try to make all that stuff a lot easier with a lot of book cover design tutorials, publishing and marketing tutorials on YouTube, and tons of free content, because I do believe everybody should be able to tell their story without necessarily investing to hire somebody for help. However, on the flip side of that, people always ask me, how do I market my book? How do I sell my book? And they're always looking for like $5,000 book launch packages, which absolutely will not work, because they didn't do any of this stuff. Choosing the audience, figuring out the genre, making sure your cover and the keywords and your title and the subtitle do all of the things that they should be doing, and the blurb. Those are like the critical pieces of everything that's going to matter forever. And that's why most authors fail. That's why 99% of authors lose money publishing and never are able to promote their book profitably. It's because they didn't do any of this stuff, which is why I thought, I know I talk too much and I've got tons of videos on this already, but I thought a very specific case study with some applicable advice might be really useful. If you need actual feedback from me, you can look for the Guerrilla Publishing Program or join the free Guerrilla Publishing group on Facebook. We have a weekly thread where you can throw in your cover or your blurb for feedback. I don't always have time to, respond to everything, but there's a lot of, I think like 8,000 people in there already who are pretty helpful, and they're usually pretty good with feedback as well. Thanks a lot. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or you'd like to see any other types of videos from me. Thanks. Bye-bye.